Hello and welcome back. This is the week 10 lecture. So we are back on our regular schedule now. I do apologize for reusing an old lecture last week, but like I mentioned in the module, I was out of town for most of week 8. So I got back very early in week 9. Didn't really have time to stick to my normal recording schedule, so I just decided to use an old Poe lecture, but the material really hasn't changed since the last time I taught 451, so the text should have been the same. My lecture was essentially the same as what it would have been, but generally I like to do new lectures each semester since each semester is different, and I feel like I can always improve upon them. So that's the one time you'll get an old lecture for the rest of the semester. Of course, I'll be making them fresh. So hopefully we were able to get through all of the Poe text. I hope you guys enjoyed those. Poe is usually an author that we can still enjoy. So we're continuing through the American Renaissance. As I've mentioned, we've already covered a few key figures from that era, and that's a particular historical period that I want you guys to be familiar with, the American Renaissance. I've talked about it before. Back in week 8, I think I first introduced the concept as we were getting ready to read Hawthorne. But here in week 10, I spend a little bit more time on it in the overview. So if you guys are in the module, or if you are going to be soon, just make sure to take a look at the overview, the week 10 overview. I hope you guys are reading those each week because I always provide a summary of what we're talking about each week inside the overview. So if you click on that overview on the main module page, you'll be able to go inside and read basically a written summary of what I cover in lecture and what we're looking at in terms of our text for that week. So this week I've included a lot of information about the American Renaissance. A lot of that's repeated from my week 8 lecture, but I just wanted to provide it in written form so you guys can remember a few key details about this particular period in American literary history. So when we talk about the Renaissance, we're really talking about a pretty small span of time in the middle of the 19th century. So like I said, when American literature was first sort of getting standardized as an academic discipline, roughly 100 years ago, actually a little bit less, more like 85 to 90 years ago, a group of academics, literary scholars, many of whom worked at prestigious institutions like Harvard, they got together and sort of defined the most important authors and the most important texts that had been produced up to that point in American literary history. And they placed a really outsized importance on a very sort of short period in the 1850s, specifically between 1850 and 1855. And they identified a group of authors who were active during that time and who published really important works during that time. So this guy, F.O. Matheson, who I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, he taught at Harvard. He was sort of the ringleader of this group. He was helping to really define what American literature was, how it was going to be seen, how it was going to be studied, how we were going to define it, and how we were going to sort of rank or prioritize certain authors over others. So as I mentioned in week 8, we have a select group of authors who were really sort of, handpicked by Matheson and these other scholars in the 1930s and 1940s and kind of held up as exemplary sort of models or sort of the best examples of American authors and American texts. So Hawthorne was a part of that, and during this sort of golden age, that 5-year period in the early 1850s, he produces The Scarlet Letter, perhaps his best known novel. We read a couple of his short stories a couple of weeks ago, so we've already talked about Hawthorne. Also, Poe was not originally included by Matheson in this group of American Renaissance figures, but later on Poe would be included. They would sort of go back retroactively and place Poe row in this select group. Also Herman Melville, who we're going to be reading next week, Walt Whitman, along with Ralph Waldo Emerson, and a few other figures, most of whom we'll at least mention briefly over the next few weeks. So that was the group, and some of the texts that these scholars were focused on were works like The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables, also by Hawthorne, Moby Dick by Herman Melville, which came out in 1851, Leaves of Grass by Whitman, which came out in 1855. So essentially, these scholars looked at that body of work and the authors who produced it and said that was really the first true flowering of American literary culture. That was the point at which we differentiated ourselves from other countries, other national literary traditions, and really began to create a literature of our own. Now, again, that was the old-fashioned way of looking at it. That's how scholars looked at it for many decades. But more recently, there has been a pretty vigorous debate, and a lot of people have begun to break away from that sort of older way of viewing American literary history. And there's an ongoing debate about which other authors we should include, and where should we start our tour of American literary history. You guys see the choice that I made. We went back to the 1500s, to the real dawn of the exploration age in the New World. Different, scholars would go to different places in history to start, but a lot of us have come around to acknowledging the importance of earlier authors like Charles Broughton Brown, like Washington Irving, like Hannah Webster Foster and Susanna Ralston, and some of these sentimental novelists of the 1790s. Those authors really kind of laid the groundwork for the future generation of Renaissance authors who we're going to be talking about for these next few weeks, kind of set the stage for those guys to come along later and build on what had already been done. So I just wanted to kind of review some of that. We did talk about it briefly a couple of weeks ago, but I really want to make sure you guys sort of see the American Renaissance as a historical era, and also as sort of, what many considered to be the pinnacle of early American literature. Certainly 19th century American literature, sort of the high point, the point at which we began to sort of distinguish ourselves as a literary producing people. But of course, you don't have to accept that logic. You don't have to accept that particular reading. And like I've said, increasingly, a lot of modern scholars, modern students, don't really accept Matheson's group, these categories that were created back in the 1940s, because as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this original group of American Renaissance writers were pretty much all male. They were all white. So it was a very sort of homogenous group. And as time has passed, we have attempted to expand the American literary canon, include more authors, include more women, more authors of color, different perspectives, try to diversify. That's an ongoing process, but certainly we no longer think about things in quite the same kinds of like rigid, really sort of highly stratified ways, right? We're sort of expanding things, we're expanding categories, we're broadening definitions. But these authors, these Renaissance authors, remain important, even if we don't think they're the end-all, be-all. They're not the only important American authors from the 19th century, but they certainly are important. But another thing I mentioned a couple of weeks ago is that many of these Renaissance figures were not wildly popular during their lifetimes, during their active writing careers. So that's another interesting phenomenon to observe. When Matheson and those scholars were getting together and sort of creating the notion of the American Renaissance in the early 1940s, they were in many ways rehabilitating, or even in some cases rediscovering, some texts that had fallen out of favor, or some texts that had just never really found a huge audience in their day. And the consensus that a lot of these guys reached is that part of the reason for that was that authors like Hawthorne and Melville and Whitman were ahead of their time. Poe as well. They were kind of ahead of their time. They were innovative in ways that could be appreciated perhaps more by 20th century people as opposed to 19th century readers. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind as well. And this week, we're going to take a tour of some more popular literature of the mid-19th century, because that's the paradox. You know, we spend all this time with these American Renaissance figures, but we often overlook the stuff that was actually popular during the time that we are studying. So that's always been kind of an interesting thing, right? We've prioritized texts that weren't popular back then, and we've largely forgotten or dismissed many of the texts that were popular back then. And I want us to think a little bit more about that. I want us to sort of interrogate that a little bit and form our own opinions. So unfortunately, we cannot really do justice to a lot of the popular fiction of the era because we're only really devoting this 1 week to it. But I wanted to give you guys sort of a selection, a little bit of a variety of different texts to sample, just so we can get a general idea, just so we can get sort of a sense of the flavor of some of these different popular genres, just so we can do a little bit of comparative analysis. I want us to compare some of the stuff that we're reading this week to Hawthorne, Poe, Melville, and Whitman. All of these sort of classic Renaissance figures that get studied and talked about all the time and have been pretty steadily ever since the 1940s. Let's contrast them with the stuff that was really popular back in the mid-19th century. Because again, it might be a fair claim to state that, you know, Melville and Hawthorne were a little too innovative. They were maybe pushing the envelope in certain ways. That's certainly true of Melville. I think Whitman as well. They've sort of been claimed by a lot of contemporary scholars as sort of postmodern or just modern in general, modern thinkers, modern writers in ways that didn't exactly endear them to readers back in the 1850s, but does make them still relevant and you know, important for us to read today. And in many ways, they're sort of anticipating future developments, future changes and innovations in American literature. And in Poe, that's certainly true of Poe and Hawthorne as well, because they were such prominent early practitioners of the short story. So they're helping to pave the way for future generations of short story writers. Melville's doing a lot of experimental things in his novels. Whitman is doing some confessional, experimental stuff in his poetry. And some of those trends would continue well beyond their lifetimes. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about those guys, that's fine, but I want us to also just gain a little bit more appreciation and understanding of some of the popular genres, some of the popular texts of the mid-19th century, again, so we can perform a little bit of comparative analysis. So this is a pretty light reading week overall. We don't have a ton to get through, and that is by design. So this is a good chance for you guys to get caught up if you are still finishing some of our previous texts, if you're still finishing up Edgar Huntley or Hope Leslie, or if you're still working your way through some of the Poe or even the Hawthorne and the Irving that we read back in week 8. This is a good week to get caught up and back on schedule because we don't have a ton to get through, nothing extremely long. I'm giving you a couple of short stories to read, some sort of journalistic pieces from Lydia Maria Child, and then just some excerpts from a couple of well-known sentimental novels. So pretty light week. Hopefully you can get through all of our new stuff quickly. And then if you need to wrap up some older stuff, you will have time to do that. But I want everybody to sort of be back on schedule by next week, because we are starting Melville next week. And we're reading both Benito Cereno and some excerpts from the Encantadas, which is a collection of related short stories and sketches that all sort of work together to create one larger narrative. But it's going to be a pretty heavy week. Benito Cereno is not quite a novel. We might call it a novella or a short novel. It's a little bit longer than a short story, not quite as long as a novel. But between that text, which is a bit of a challenge, and then a few selections from the Encantadas, we're going to have a lot to do next week. And then in week 12, we're wrapping up the American Renaissance unit by reading Leaves of Grass by Whitman. And we're trying to get through that entire volume of poetry in 1 week. And we'll also read a little bit from Emerson, just so we can kind of shoehorn him and the Transcendentalists in there before we move on. So we have a couple of busier weeks coming up, and then we move on to our fourth and final unit in week 13, and that includes our final novel of the semester, Blake, which is a long, complex, rather difficult novel, and that's going to eat up our last couple of weeks of the semester. So this is a good time to make sure that you're up to date with your reading, so you'll be able to stay on top of things for these next few weeks. As we finish up, we're kind of entering the home stretch here, our sort of final push towards the end of the semester. So let's just run through all of the text that I've posted for us to read this week. And I will try to keep this lecture relatively brief. I know we had a lot to watch last week with Poe. I think week 8 was pretty lengthy as well. So I'll try to keep this to just one part. We'll just have one lecture today, no part 1 and part 2. I can get through everything pretty quickly, but I want to make sure that we're reading all of the selections that I've made available. So let's start with the sentimental novels. We don't have time to read an entire sentimental novel. However, if you like either one of these two that we are sampling, you can certainly read the entire book when you have time, maybe after the semester, and I can always give you a little bit more info about these authors or other similar sentimental novelists. But what I want us to check out is just the first chapter from The Lamplighter. That was a pretty well-known 1854 sentimental novel written by Maria Cummins. And then I've also posted a link to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, perhaps the most famous of all 19th century sentimental novels. I've mentioned this book before. So when we were doing our historical tour, whenever that was, like back in week 2 or week 3, you might remember I talked a little bit about the first best-selling novel in American history, which was Charlotte Temple, written by Susanna Rowson in 1792. A book very similar in terms of plot to The Coquette. Another example of the seduction tale, which is, of course, a subgenre of the larger sentimental novel category. So Rowson, sometimes we argue whether or not that's truly an American novel, because Rowson was actually born in England, spent much of her adult life in the U.S. But Charlotte Temple, very successful both here and in England, and it remained the best-selling work of literature in America from 1792 all the way up until 1852, when Uncle Tom's Cabin came out and eclipsed it. So very interesting to observe that our first two huge bestsellers were both sentimental novels. Now, they're very different in terms of subject matter, in terms of style. Uncle Tom's Cabin is not a simple seduction tale in the way that Charlotte Temple is. It has a much larger sort of goal, really. This novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's, of course, very famous in American history because it's very much about slavery and conditions in the South in the decades leading up to the Civil War. So it really is a work of social commentary. It's sort of a reform-minded novel. Stowe was an abolitionist, and she was sort of championing that particular cause, trying to alert a lot of other Americans to the horrors of slavery and the need to get rid of it. So And many historians, not just lit people, but a lot of historians will point to this novel as playing a role in sort of intensifying the conflict that would eventually break out in the form of the American Civil War in the early 1860s. Not that this book caused the war or started the war, but it had a huge readership, of course, so it had a lot of, it converted a lot of readers to the abolitionist cause. It convinced a lot of people who may have previously been sort of on the fence or just sort of indifferent about slavery. It convinced them to maybe take a stronger stand. And of course, the nation was very divided at that time. Much of America had already abolished slavery, but of course the South continued to maintain the institution. And that's the largest factor that eventually led to the Civil War. So the book is often remembered a little bit more for sort of its social impact. The sort of larger role it played in American history. But it's also just a good example of a really popular, really successful sentimental novel. So a lot of the things that we were talking about back with The Coquette, when I was sort of introducing the sentimental novel as a genre, as a popular genre in early American literature, we talked about it as often being defined as basically just books that really work on heightened emotions. They are trying to make readers feel very specific, very strong emotions. So we sometimes liken this to melodrama. I think I mentioned soap operas and maybe Lifetime movies. Sometimes we can really draw a through line from the sentimental novels of the 19th century to a lot of forms of popular entertainment that stay with us, remain with us today. Improbable events, the heightened emotions, often a lot of focus on relationships, both familial and romantic. Characters overcoming hardships, overcoming great loss and tragedy. We can see stuff like this all the time. It has not totally gone out of style. And not all sentimental novels were super over the top and melodramatic, but some were. So when you're reading that first chapter of The Lamplighter, you might sort of see what I mean when I talk about melodrama, sort of, again, really strong emotional pitches, things that are sort of designed to make readers, again, feel a wide variety of emotions. Pity, terror at times, like feeling, fear for a character or feeling bad about certain social conditions. Again, that's very much what Stowe is doing in Uncle Tom's Cabin. She's trying to show things as they were in the South, and some of it was meant to be shocking. Some of it was meant to just move readers, to affect readers in a profound, very emotional way. So oftentimes it was thought that books that did this could not only provide entertainment, but they could also provide a form of moral instruction. So we talked about this with The Coquette. And Charlotte Temple was functioning in a very similar way in that those seduction tales were sort of meant to teach young girls what not to do. Sort of almost like instructions for young women entering the sort of dating world, as they are coming of age and looking for husbands. These books are demonstrating some of the dangers, some of the mistakes that they need to avoid in order to avoid the tragic fates of a lot of these protagonists, like Eliza, or like Charlotte Temple in Ralston's best-selling novel. So we discussed that. There's sort of this moral instruction. And it was often called back then this idea of right feeling. Sort of making people sort of better citizens, making people better Christians. That's often how these books were marketed. And as we've mentioned, many of these sentimental novels were written by women, and many of them featured female protagonists. So they were often dismissed as overtly feminine, even though Men also wrote sentimental novels. Men also read sentimental novels, and of course there were also male characters in these books. But they were often thought of as being primarily targeted to women, often young women, and there was that moral instruction component that sort of helped to justify the books. So this is not just a titillating, melodramatic, good time. It also teaches us something. There's a moral to the story. That's kind of the idea. But this notion of right feeling is kind of interesting. Again, it's very much tied up with ideas of Christian charity. It's very much tied up with the idea of sympathy. And we're going to return to this idea when we talk about Child's Letters from New York, because she's very much operating within the same register. There's this idea that, when readers encounter narratives that feature a lot of suffering, narratives that feature characters going through a lot, losing people close to them, getting jilted in a relationship, losing their social status, being on their own in some kind of frightening way. When we encounter narratives like that, we instinctively sympathize with the characters, right? We feel bad for them. We're rooting for them. I think we can relate to this idea because it's still very much a part of how we consume books and movies and shows. We often connect to the lead characters. We root for them. We feel bad for them when bad things happen to them, and we ultimately hope that good things will happen to them. So by investing in these characters in such an emotional way, the logic goes that we sort of just become better people. We become more sympathetic. We maybe even become more empathetic. Empathy often being thought of as an even stronger emotion than sympathy. But we learn how to care about others. We might even be inspired to help others. And there's this idea that by developing sympathy and care for fictional characters, that allows readers to transfer a lot of that emotional material to real life and apply that to real life situations. So if you feel great sympathy for the protagonist of a sentimental novel, you might be more inclined to help the poor or the needy in real life. Maybe you'll go and help out at a soup kitchen. Maybe you'll donate some money to charity. Maybe you'll do something for kids who don't have, school supplies or whatever. That's kind of the logic, is that, by creating these sympathetic feelings, these feelings of charity, it just makes people better. It makes people kinder. It makes them better citizens. And like I said, better Christians. But there's also this idea that you can kind of put yourself in other people's shoes. It makes you more capable of relating to other people who might have experiences very different from yours. But by reading about them, by sympathizing with them in fictional form, you're better equipped to understand others, to be tolerant, to be non-judgmental. And again, it's funny because a lot of those things still get talked about as the virtues of just reading fiction in general. You guys might have heard some of those arguments before. A lot of scholars and, people who teach will say, oh, well, if you read fiction, you do kind of become a better person. You understand people who are different from you. You can put yourself in these different perspectives. You can kind of walk in other people's shoes, sympathize with people. And that's just good in a general way. But a lot of those ideas were specifically sort of applied to sentimental novels from the 19th century. So we can see that, I think, in both of the examples, right? We're being invited to feel emotions for these characters. Emotions of remorse, pity, sympathy, whatever. It's going to be different for different readers. But those heightened emotions will lead to positive outcomes in terms of just, our overall moral sort of orientation. But in the case of Uncle Tom's Cabin, again, there's something bigger going on. It's not just about those sort of general abstract concepts of charity and kindness and sympathy. It's also about a very specific American problem that Stowe wants us to rectify. Right? So it's kind of a call to arms. I mean, not literally, but it's sort of an announcement or a reminder or a really sort of bracing wake-up call for a lot of readers, like, hey, this is a major problem, it's affecting a lot of people, and we really need to do something about it. And again, many people would argue that it had a huge role because so many people read it. It created a lot of debate. A lot of people in the South hated it. A lot of the abolitionist movements in the North and other parts of the U.S. gained steam because of it. And there's a famous story. I don't know if it's true. It might be apocryphal, but the legend has it that years later, Abraham Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe years after the book comes out. And he says, oh, you're the little lady that started the big war, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. I don't know if that ever actually happened, but that story has a lot of traction because that is the way a lot of people sort of understand her novel. So I just want you guys to read the first chapter of The Lamplighter. You don't have to go beyond it, but if you have the time and you're interested, feel free to read more. And then I would like you to read the first 4 chapters of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So this book, again, came out in 1852, so it finally eclipsed Charlotte Temple as our biggest bestseller almost exactly 60 years after Charlotte Temple came out. So even though they're tackling very different subject matter, different stylistically, again, we can see how they're both categorized as sentimental novels. Again, Charlotte Temple's telling pretty much the same story as The Coquette. So just like The Coquette, it wants us to feel certain heightened emotions. Maybe we were sympathetic towards Eliza. Maybe we were angry at times. Maybe we feared for her safety at times. But that's the whole idea, right? Make us feel, make us sympathize with these characters, and also provide moral instruction. That's what The Coquette's doing. That's what Uncle Tom's Cabin is doing as well, even though they're quite different in many other ways. So as I've said, the sentimental novel genre is very broad. It's not so much about subject matter. It's more about, again, these sort of moral values, the heightened emotions. Sometimes it does verge on the border of melodrama. That's why I mentioned soap operas or like Lifetime movies. But there can be a lot of different kinds of sentimental novels. It's important to remember that it's a pretty heterogeneous category because it's not so much about subject matter, it's more about feeling. So there were a lot of other really popular, successful, sentimental authors of the mid-19th century. Many of them were women. So like we said, that this was a genre kind of dominated by women writers and often thought to be largely dominated by women readers, but that's always a little bit of a simplification. There's always going to be a more diverse readership than what that might imply. But there's this sort of general air of femininity that surrounded those texts, and that's probably a good reason why Matheson and those scholars at the Ivy League schools back in the 1930s and 1940s neglected to include a lot of these sentimental novels when they were creating the American literary canon and sort of creating this idea of the American Renaissance. So if you remember 2 weeks ago, we mentioned, Hawthorne at one point was lamenting his own lack of success in a letter to a friend. And he has this famous quote where he mentions the damned mob of scribbling women. To basically refer to these sentimental novelists who were selling a lot more books than he was. But later in that same letter, he actually mentions Maria Cummins by name, the author of The Lamplighter. So she's a prime example of the type of novelist that he is disparaging, the type of novelist that he clearly does not think very highly of. There were some other prominent sentimental novelists of that same period, Fanny Fern, Eden Southward. Some of them wrote under pseudonyms, and as we mentioned, some even published anonymously, like some of the older sentimental novelists like Hannah Webster Foster. But Harriet Beecher Stowe published under her own name, became quite famous, and others did too. So again, there's this divide between the sort of the high literature, the literary fiction that's associated with the American Renaissance, with Hawthorne, Melville, and the like. And there's that sharp line dividing that from the popular fiction, which was in part sentimental novels. And I would liken it a little bit to what we see today. I mean, this dividing line is not completely gone. We still have a distinction between what we might call literary fiction versus popular fiction. So if we're thinking about sort of modern day inheritors of the sentimental novel tradition, I would just posit a couple of authors that are very popular today, such as Leanne Moriarty or even Colleen Hoover, who's a hugely successful best-selling author right now. And again, just think a little, if you're familiar with those authors or if you've heard anything about them, I think you'll see what I mean. Like, it's not the same, right? It's not a straight line from 19th century sentimental novels to these sort of romance novels, or sometimes, maybe they're thrillers, but they often are thought of. The books of Hoover would be an example, and this isn't always accurate, but they're all often thought of as being created by women for women. Again, that's not always the case, but they are thought of as having a largely feminine readership. They often feature female protagonists. They're often centered around, again, relationships or what we might call domestic issues. And that's a term that's, again, was often used back in the 19th century to describe the sort of milieu or the setting that we would often find ourselves in a sentimental novel. We were often in the home. We were often following the adventures of women who, again, as we know, had limited opportunities, in some cases zero opportunities, to break into the workforce or to join the military or go and see the world the way male characters could. So they were often confined to the home, family life, the search for a husband, like we saw in The Coquette. So those were domestic issues, and they were often thought of as less important or less interesting by the male scholars and critics who dominated the literary scene back then, and the male authors like Hawthorne, who thought sentimental novels were beneath them. Thought that, they weren't tackling the kind of important subject matter that he was tackling, the important kind of thematic material that he and his male contemporaries were tackling. So again, we can reject that line of thinking, and a lot of modern people do. But we should be aware of how some of these distinctions get made. So a lot of people look at the books by Hoover and they say, well, that's not art. That's popular fiction. It's entertaining. It's easy to read, it's fun, it's not too taxing, and people like it. But then there might be a distinction made between that and, a literary author, like someone like Cormac McCarthy. I was just talking to one of you about McCarthy recently. He would be thought of as a more literary writer, not as accessible, drawing more heavily on history and philosophy. Not reaching quite as wide of a readership, although a lot of people do like McCarthy. Often dealing with dark themes, difficult, depressing subject matter. That's not always true of literary fiction, but many times it is. A real attention to realism, getting details right. If you guys read some of McCarthy's Border Trilogy stuff, the stuff set in Mexico that he wrote back in the 80s, I mean, he's really giving us a granular level of detail when it comes to the flora and the fauna. If you think Cabeza de Vaca is bad, I mean, you should read McCarthy's sort of vision of the desert. He wants to tell you what everything's called. He wants to talk about obscure animals. He's going to throw in some Spanish. He's going to reference the Bible. He's going to be riffing on older literary figures like Faulkner and Hemingway. And that's how we sort of define literary fiction. It's denser, it's a little bit more complex, a little bit less accessible for non-English majors, perhaps. There's a real specific, particular sense of place. And again, that's the stuff that scholars and critics like, but it's not always super popular with readers. And that, again, is sort of this central sort of problem that we're encountering this week. I was reading this really interesting article about Hoover and her books, and how, why they're so successful, sort of trying to explore this huge, diverse readership that she's found, and talking about how a lot of the word of mouth about her books has kind of occurred through social media, and how people really have these profound, strong emotional reactions when they read Hoover's novels. But yet Hoover is often dismissed, by lit scholars and professors and critics as being sort of inferior in quality to, somebody like McCarthy. And one specific complaint that I was reading about was the fact that she doesn't create, and I don't know, I haven't really read much of her work, so I can't speak to this personally, but the author of this article was citing a critic who was slamming Hoover for not creating specific settings. Like, apparently one of her books was set in Boston, but the critic was like, yeah, there's no details here that would really speak to Boston. Like, there's no details that really make you feel like you're in Boston. She doesn't get the dialect right. She doesn't get the geography right. She doesn't really provide a lot of specificity. And that's a problem in the eyes of this critic. But what the author of the article was pointing out was that actually a lot of readers like that. A lot of readers like the fact that she's not getting super specific about her settings, because then you can imagine that you're there, no matter where you are. Even if you've never been to Boston, you've never seen Boston, you don't know anything about Boston, it doesn't matter. Because there's that lack of specificity, you can just imagine that this book is taking place in your hometown or in some place that you're familiar with. So the author of the article was saying what critics see as a problem, a lot of readers might view as a virtue. They can put themselves there. They can relate to what Hoover's describing regardless of differences in geography or culture. So that was really interesting to me, because I think that often happens with popular literature. Critics slam it for being maybe somewhat generic or not as innovative or original as some literary fiction, but they're overlooking the stuff that a lot of readers want. A lot of readers want familiar tropes, kind of familiar storylines, maybe somewhat familiar character types, and they want those heightened emotions. They want to feel something. They want to sympathize with characters. They want to root for characters. They want to hate certain characters, because that can be fun too. So again, we can't dismiss any book that produces the kinds of strong emotional reactions that Hoover's books produce. Again, these are readers that might not be English majors. They might not want to study literature at a really high level. They want to be entertained. They want to be moved. They want to be able to relate to characters. And popular fiction often delivers on all of that. So that was true of the sentimental novels back then, and I think it's true in authors like Moriarty and Hoover that we see today. And again, different books will have different subject matters. Some might just be romances. Others kind of have thriller elements. But that's kind of true of how older sentimental novels were too. Again, diverse subject matters, diverse plots. But those heightened feelings and maybe even a little moral instruction, but that emotional response is often front and center. So maybe we can see some connections between then and now. And the final point I wanted to make, there's just a book that I want to mention. I might try to link you guys to it if I can find an ebook version. Really interesting take on Uncle Tom's Cabin and the power of sentimental novels in general. So a really famous literary scholar named Jane Tompkins wrote this, I want to say in the 80s, maybe in the 90s. The book is called Sentimental Power: Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Politics of Literary History. And I'm actually stealing some of her material because she talks a lot about the formation of the American literary canon and how a lot of these very successful female authors were excluded because it was thought that sentimental novels just weren't as good as Moby Dick, The Scarlet Letter, and Leaves of Grass. But Tompkins makes this argument that, in fact, the women authors had a much bigger social impact than Hawthorne, Poe, or Melville ever did. And it's hard to argue that point. She's really making an argument about the power of women's emotions, because again, that's sort of the centerpiece of sentimental novels, that emotional response. And she's saying it was these emotions that were often dismissed by men, often laughed at or thought of as, part of what made women inferior, right? They were too emotional. They couldn't be rational thinkers like men. But paradoxically, those very qualities ended up having a huge social impact, and she uses Uncle Tom's Cabin as an example. The emotions that Stowe was tapping into helped to ultimately end slavery. Of course, it was a very bloody struggle. But Tompkins argues that the kind of critique that Stowe makes in that novel was a lot more effective. That social commentary was a lot more effective when Stowe did it than it ever was in the hands of one of these American Renaissance figures like Melville. And we're actually going to see an example of that, because Melville is providing some social commentary in Benito Cereno. And we'll see that next week. But he does it in such an ambiguous way, in a way that not everybody picks up on, and not everybody is going to make a real strong emotional connection to it. So as a result, Melville leaves us with questions and mystery, and some people like that. And some people feel like, okay, I get the message, and he's also providing this sort of anti-slavery message. But when Melville does it, it's so weird, and you have to work so hard to get at it, that it alienates some readers. I mean, we can admit that. I love Melville, and I can admit that. He alienates some readers. He's difficult. He's not an easy read. And some of those challenges are not always rewarding for all readers. But Tompkins is saying Stowe provides a critique that's more clear. It was more accessible. You didn't have to be a literary scholar to appreciate it. It was made for the masses. It was made for regular people. Therefore, it was more effective. It was more skillfully done, and it had a much bigger social impact. And again, kind of hard to argue when you're just doing a direct comparison between the two. But nowadays, not many people read Stowe. Not as many people teach her, whereas Melville is always a huge component of any early American literature survey. So we get to form our own opinions, but I just want you guys to get a little bit involved in some of these politics of literary history, like Tompkins mentions in her book title, because that's always a part of this. And especially now, when we are sort of reevaluating a lot of things that we took for granted through much of the 20th century. And we can participate in sort of making some new categories, redefining things, or just deciding that the old ways of looking at American literature are not necessarily going to be our ways. You guys are always welcome to arrive at some of those kinds of conclusions. Okay, so that's probably enough on the sentimental novels. Let's move on and talk about another popular genre of the 1840s and 1850s, Old Southwestern humor. So I talk about this a little bit in the overview as well. We don't have time to do this genre much justice. This will really be the only week that we talk about it. But again, just thinking about what was popular, what were people reading, what were people really enjoying during the middle of the 19th century, here's another example of a popular genre that hasn't always gotten a lot of scholarly treatment, because it's often thought of as being maybe less important, but certainly it was more popular than a lot of the Renaissance stuff during its time. So when we talk about the Old Southwest, it's important to think about geography for a moment. We don't mean the Southwest of today. We're not talking about New Mexico, Arizona. We're talking about the Old Southwest, back when America was not quite as big. So if you go back to before the Mexican-American War, our western boundary obviously did not extend as far. So the Old Southwest was a sort of general term that was often used to refer to what we would now just think of as parts of the South, even the Deep South. So this would be Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Tennessee, parts of Arkansas, and Louisiana. What you have to remember is in the 1830s, 40s, and even up until the 1850s, a lot of those regions were still considered the frontier. American civilization prior to the Civil War had not extended that far beyond the Mississippi River, which can be kind of hard for us to think about as modern people because we have this much larger conception of what America is. But America was smaller in the 1840s. So a lot of these parts that would later just become sort of assimilated into the South, they were frontier districts up until just a little ways before the Civil War. You know, parts of Alabama and Mississippi still belonged to Native American tribes up until the 1830s. So a lot of the tropes, a lot of the character types, a lot of the storylines that we associate with Westerns and sort of what we think of as the American West, a lot of that stuff originated in old Southwestern humor and frontier romance. So we've already talked about frontier romance as another popular early genre, particularly when it comes to novels. So Catherine Maria Sedgwick, James Fenimore Cooper, we talked about them back in week 7, sort of exploring America's frontier past and sort of making fiction out of our unique regional histories. So Southwestern humor was doing something similar, but it was not taking itself nearly as seriously. So it was comedic in nature, but it was often focused on these frontier communities where civilization, as it would have been understood by most white readers at the time, had not yet taken hold. So these were kind of chaotic places, liminal spaces, if you guys are familiar with that term. Lit scholars love to talk about liminal spaces, these in-between spaces. Not quite the wilderness anymore, but not quite civilization either. You know, it takes time to develop a lot of civic institutions like churches and schools, you know, and local governments and police forces. So in a lot of frontier communities, there was a lot of crime, you know, a lot of alcohol consumption, fighting, a lot of land speculation, a lot of people ripping each other off. Of course, Native Americans were being cheated out of a lot of their land. In some cases, it was being bought from them for very low prices. In other cases, just taken outright. Treaties were made and broken in rapid succession. So it was kind of chaotic, as you can imagine. And if you're a fan of Westerns, like if you watch old Western movies, again, you're going to recognize some of these tropes because they show up many decades later in sort of future Western places as our Western border continued to move to its modern place. So one thing that you'll notice in our selections for this week when we're looking at Simon Suggs is one thing about the frontier is that sort of social roles were in flux. There wasn't a strong social order yet. Right? And again, this makes sense if you think about it, and this was very destabilizing at the time. This is also a big reason why these new settlements, these new lands, these new states were very attractive to ambitious people who wanted to go and buy land and sort of make a new life for themselves. Remember Ichabod back in Sleepy Hollow. He wants to buy some land in Kentucky or Tennessee, or to be more specific, he wants to use Katrina's family money to buy some land in one of these sort of frontier states. Again, Tennessee was often lumped in with the old Southwest. He wants to go out there, buy some land, maybe, you know, build a big farm and make money. And that's what a lot of Americans were looking to do. But of course, this was very exploitative in nature. Not only were they taking a lot of this land from the Chickasaw and the Choctaw and the Creek Indians, many of whom were later removed during Indian removal. We talked about that a few weeks ago. That policy got underway in the 1830s. So it's very much a backdrop to the old Southwestern humor. But, you know, not only were the new settlers taking land, sometimes by force, from the native tribes in those areas, they were also, of course, employing slave labor, oftentimes, to build their new homes and to build their plantations and their farms. So it was exploitative. A lot of money was changing hands. It was very violent, very crime-ridden. So that's the backdrop of the old Southwestern humorists. That's the setting that they are working with. They're exploring these frontier places. But one of the things they get a lot of humor out of is the fact that certain types of people, people like Simon Suggs, who would have been kind of marginal in more polite society, in more established societies back on the eastern seaboard, someone like Simon Suggs would have been viewed as kind of disreputable, a sort of layabout. He doesn't really work. He's a gambler. He doesn't have very good morals. But out on the frontier, he can sort of remake himself. Again, a recurring American theme. He can remake himself. He can become somebody new. He's often impersonating other people. I mean, he's a con man. And he's meant to be a comic figure. He's not really meant to be admirable or sympathetic at all, but he represents the type of people who can go to the frontier and make a quick buck, often by exploiting and cheating others. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that we can sort of observe in some of these stories. And it's also interesting to notice how a lot of this history got buried. So we don't have time to get too far into this, but there's a great book called Fetching the Old Southwest by a historian named James Justice. And he talks about this period from the 1830s up until basically like a decade before the Civil War, this kind of frontier era of the Old Southwest. And he says, after the Civil War, the sort of lost cause authors of the South, you guys might be familiar with that concept. A lot of Southern writers after the Civil War sort of tried to champion the Confederacy and sort of write this, sort of rewrite history and write sort of a rosy, sort of idyllic depiction of what Southern life had been before the Civil War. But when they did that, they kind of cut out the frontier. They cut out the Old Southwest, and they created an antebellum South that was very genteel, very courtly, dominated by aristocratic planters and contented slaves. And of course, that's not accurate. There were some very rich planters, but they were the minority, and they were mostly back on the seaboard in older southern states like Virginia and South Carolina. So this kind of rowdy frontier era that really dominated this middle portion in a lot of these places, this middle portion of the 19th century, it kind of got glossed over because it didn't fit into that lost cause mythology. Because these weren't aristocrats, right? Simon Suggs is nobody's aristocrat. He's not genteel. He's not courtly. He's a drinker, a gambler, a liar. He's a con man. So we're invited to laugh at him, but again, he's not exactly the personage that these lost cause writers wanted to hold up as sort of emblematic of what the South was. So these stories, these old Southwestern humor tales, not only are they pretty funny and entertaining, but they're also kind of important historical documents because they sort of record a lot of this sort of ragtag democracy, that's how Justice describes it, of the frontier settlements. He talks about the violence, the raw manners, the bawdiness, and what he calls the rampant criminality of the frontier, but also, as I was mentioning before, this certain fluidity of social classes. This idea that poor people, can go out to the frontier and make a lot of money, maybe not always in ways that are strictly legal, and they can become powerful and influential on the frontier in ways that they never could back in old Virginia or the Carolinas, where a lot of them originally came from. So these the sketch that I posted from Simon Suggs called "The Captain Attends a Camp Meeting" is written by Johnson Jones Hooper. And Hooper's a good example of one of these old Southwestern humorists. He was originally from North Carolina, but he settled in Alabama during its frontier days and lived most of his life there. He was primarily a newspaper man. That was kind of his primary career. and he wrote some of these these humorous sketches kind of on the side. A lot of the Southwestern humor appeared as short stories or really short sketches that would often be published in newspapers or other popular periodicals of the day. So these were short, easily digestible stories, very much comic in nature. Usually they have a certain structure that Hooper and a lot of the other practitioners of the genre used, where you would have an ironic, sort of detached tone, and often even a genteel narrator who's sort of distinct or apart from the main action. And he's just sort of presenting the story. He's relating certain events to the readers, but there's this level of separation, this level of detachment that often invites readers to laugh at the lower class, kind of ignorant characters that are often on display. And you'll see some evidence of that in The Captain Attends a Camp Meeting. But at the same time, we can't exactly identify with Simon Suggs. He's not really a hero. We're invited to laugh at him as well, and we might even laugh at the way that he rips off some of these people at this religious revival, this camp meeting. But there's really no moral center. There's no moral authority. So again, very different from sentimental novels. These kinds of humor pieces are not really meant to provide moral instruction unless you just see it as maybe very satirical in a general way, the way perhaps Brackenridge was, where we're kind of invited to laugh at everybody. But another really important thing to note is that what we're seeing here, what we see both in the Hooper and in William Gilmore Simms, another practitioner of this type of short fiction, we see what might be described as frontier realism. So we've talked about frontier romance in relation to Hope Leslie and, famous works by James Fenimore Cooper like Last of the Mohicans. And we talked about how they're borrowing elements from those old, medieval romances, certain improbable events, heroic deeds, but they're combining it with the actual history of America and the actual story of how the frontier was sort of conquered or whatever. And that was, of course, a very popular genre. But again, they were often described as romances, not realistic novels, because they were putting sort of an imaginative spin on actual American history. There was a lot of invention. There was a lot of sort of fanciful, events going on, a lot of almost fantastical events, perhaps, that separated those stories from more realistic forms of fiction. But as the 19th century continues, as we continue to develop and advance as a literary nation, we start to have a little bit more of an appetite for realism. We want to see things as they really were. We don't want to see a kind of idealized version that kind of feels a little bit like a medieval romance. We want something more modern, something more truthful. And the story goes, you'll get more of this in Nick's part 2 version of 451. The story goes that after the Civil War, there's a big turn towards more realistic fiction in this country. But that trend is already in motion before the Civil War. So even though these types of stories like what we're reading this week are, they're meant to be funny, they're meant to be light, they're meant to be goofy, they're also depicting how the frontier really was. They're not romanticizing it. They're not making it seem better or more noble than it really was. These are pretty frank portrayals of the con men, the land speculators, the hunters that dominated these areas. The sort of disreputable settlers who were maybe maybe on the run or maybe just wanted to start over in a new place. So this is realism, and this would start something that would be continuing for the next several decades. And Sims, who I don't really have time now to talk about very much, is another example of one of these authors who's trying to capture some truthful depictions of the frontier, of Native Americans, something that Hooper's not very interested in. But if you look at Sims, some of his work, he's very interested in capturing Native American conflict, the true nature of some of these frontier settlements, what they were like. And again, that would continue throughout the rest of the 19th century. But just to wrap up Suggs, just in case you guys aren't familiar, a camp meeting was another sort of important part of this growing society in the Old Southwest. This was a form of like a Protestant Christian religious service. It really originated in the British Isles, but it came over with a lot of these Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians who came over and settled in what is now the American South. But these were very popular in frontier regions where people might have to travel many, many miles to get to the nearest church. Camp meetings could be held in just open space, out in a big field. And people who maybe didn't have regular preachers or regular churches to attend could travel to this camp meeting, and they would often take place over several days. You would have these itinerant ministers who would come in and preach. They would do services. People would be there maybe for multiple days. There would be singing, praying. They were very emotional events. They were a little bit like what we sometimes call revivals. They were also an opportunity to win new converts to the denomination. People could come and repent. People could come seeking redemption and ask for forgiveness and sort of be accepted into the church. So that's what's going on here. And again, Suggs is exploiting this opportunity because he is an opportunist at heart. And he's going to go there to basically rip these people off and steal their money. But notice that we're invited to laugh not only at him, but also the kind of gullible people at the camp meeting, the sort of lecherous preacher who's primarily focused on the young women in the congregation. So there's lots of different targets of ridicule. Again, a little bit like Brackenridge, where the humor kind of derives from all of these different sources. But again, Suggs is kind of representative of a rascally con man who could make his way in a new place, in a new frontier settlement. His slogan, his motto is that it's good to be shifty in a new country. And that's very much what he's often doing. But there was some other important Southwestern humor getting published at around this same time. The tradition kind of got kicked off in the 1830s by this Georgia writer named Augustus Longstreet. And he wrote a collection of short stories called Georgia Scenes. And that was published in 1835. It's not as funny as some of the stuff that came later, but he's sort of creating the blueprint for creating frontier settlements, capturing like backwoods dialect, capturing some of the violence and social disorder that really were true of those places. And then many other writers followed in his footsteps. Really famous story, I think I'll post it for this week as well, just in case you have time, called The Big Bear of Arkansas, written by T.B. Thorpe. That's very much sort of a tall tale, very much something that Mark Twain would use, sort of a style that Twain would use later, much later, when his career got underway. Also, there's a collection called The Flush Times of Alabama and Mississippi, written by Joseph Baldwin. But Hooper and Sims, the two authors that we're looking at this week, they are contemporaries. They were writing at around the same time. So again, a lot of these writers are forgotten today, and they're not read as much today. But they were certainly known by Mark Twain and Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner, these future famous Southern writers who all read the Southwestern humorists when they were younger. And they sort of absorbed some of the ideas, some of the comic stylings that we notice in Simon Suggs would later show up in a lot of Mark Twain's work. Twain is thought to have borrowed some characters, some scenarios, some specific scenes from some of these old Southwestern humorists. And again, if you read, Huck Finn or other, works by Twain, you can see some of that influence show up. So these writers kind of live on in the future generations of authors that they inspired and influenced. So they do remain relevant for that reason. And again, we can maybe find a through line from this older form of comedy to a lot of the comedy that we have today. There's some physical comedy. We're invited to laugh at sort of bumpkin type country characters. That's still around today. It might not be as popular, but for anybody who's ever watched Duck Dynasty or the Beverly Hillbillies, to go back much further, a show that my dad likes, it's kind of, those shows are kind of trafficking in the same thing. Hey, look at these ignorant sort of country characters. They're getting into some funny situations. They say funny things. A lot of that humor is still with us. Okay, so I know I'm running a little bit long, so let's wrap up by talking about Letters from New York by Lydia Maria Child. We've talked a little bit about Child already when I was introducing Hope Leslie and talking about frontier romance more generally. I mentioned that Child was another sort of early practitioner of the frontier romance. She wrote a novel in 1825 called Hobomoke, which is somewhat similar to Hope Leslie in that it's attempting to tell a very specific part of American sort of regional history, once again set in New England. Child was from Boston originally, so a little slice of New England history, but also it featured a sort of interracial romance between a Native American character and a white character, so it was a bit scandalous for that reason at the time. But like Sedgwick, Child was trying to create a more humane, fully fleshed out depiction of Native American characters. And unlike Sedgwick, Child was a full-blown social reformer. She was a champion of abolition. She was a champion for women's rights. She was a champion for Native American rights. And she was pretty outspoken and vocal about her views. And Sedgwick, as we said, was a little more quiet and kind of, withdrawn. So Child's an important writer. She did a lot of important fiction writing throughout the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s. She had a very long career. She didn't die until, I want to say, 1880. So we remember her for her frontier romance. She wrote children's literature. She wrote some poetry. She did a lot of things outside of fiction. She wasn't just a fiction writer. She's also thought of as one of our early sort of modern journalists. And that's what we're looking at this week, some examples of her journalistic writing. So she ended up as the editor of an abolitionist newspaper called the National Anti-Slavery Standard. And some of these letters that we're reading, this whole collection, it was a series of letters that she wrote as a correspondent for that paper, the National Anti-Slavery Standard. So a very explicitly abolitionist newspaper. So she edited that and also published articles in that. So throughout her career, she was doing all of these different things. She wrote this huge comparative study of religion in 1855 called The Progress of Religious Ideas, now thought of as a pretty impressive work of scholarship. And again, she's one of our first modern journalists. So the letters from New York were collected over a period of time and published in two separate volumes, one in 1843 and the other in 1845. And she became and she continued to be a pretty well-known sort of public figure and literary figure up until her death. So the letters from New York, they might not strike us as journalism in our strictly modern sense. They are sort of part reporting and part editorial. But they really did help to pioneer the whole notion of a weekly newspaper column in the U.S. And they remain probably Child's most popular work as far as what still gets read today. So they've often been described as candid, reflective. At times, they sort of feel a little bit like stream of consciousness. And she covers a wide range of subject matter. They're very observational. She's just sort of observing different things about the city. From hogs feeding in the streets, to the sunset, to the view at the Battery. She covers a lot of ground. She's talking about a lot of things, but there's also a real strong current of social commentary and a little bit of moral instruction, not dissimilar to what we were talking about with the sentimental novels. So for Child, a lot of sort of specific episodes or events in city life become opportunities for her to explore more abstract concepts or to pursue more complex truths about spirituality or the nature of human progress or other sort of big weighty topics. So you might notice that I'm just asking you guys to read the first 4 letters or so, but you might notice that a lot of these specific scenes from the city that she's describing kind of represent larger truths, or at least give her an opportunity to explore some of those larger truths. But again, I think we need a little bit of historical context here to think about New York City in the 1840s, and just think about some of the changes that are happening in America in general. A lot of people are leaving the countryside. They're leaving farms and rural areas and moving to the city, moving to these growing, very urban, very industrial metropolises like New York, like Philadelphia, like by this point, Chicago, although Chicago is still kind of a frontier town at this point, but Baltimore, Boston, all of these cities are growing, becoming sort of hubs not only of commerce, but also of culture, literary production, art. A lot of things are happening, good things, bad things. There's also a lot of poverty. There's a lot of poor people. There's a lot of exploitation, right? We don't have labor laws in some places yet, so a lot of people are working a lot. We don't have all of the modern amenities that cities have today. But a lot of writers were interested in how the country was becoming more urban, more industrialized, and in certain ways a little bit more modern. Another thing to remember that's happening right now is the growth, or was happening back then, was the growth of a middle class. This is another part of the sort of development of the modern world that we've been talking about. So we started in the early modern period with the age of exploration, the printing press, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment came a little bit later, then the Industrial Revolution, and now we're really up into the modern age, and a real byproduct of some of those earlier developments was what we would recognize as a middle class. A middle class that, was not wealthy, but had disposable income and had enough free time to read for pleasure. And that's another important thing to remember. That didn't always exist. A middle class that could consume literature in kind of a casual way, that didn't necessarily exist in earlier points in, human history. But throughout the 19th century, we're starting to get what we would recognize as a modern work week. We're starting to see more and more middle-class people who work in offices or schools, or maybe they're the manager of a factory, or they're, they own a store. So we're starting to see the emergence of a work week, Monday through Friday. We get the weekends off. What are you going to do in your free time? Maybe pick up a novel, pick up a newspaper. Remember, novels and newspapers kind of develop alongside one another as middle-class forms of entertainment and information. You can read some short stories, right? All of these more recent literary forms that we've talked about, the novel, the short story, the newspaper, and that's not necessarily literature, but those were all associated with the rising middle class, right? Middle class people read novels, read short stories, read newspapers. And of course, wealthy people did too. But wealthy people and, powerful, elite, affluent people were often still associated with certain forms of high art. the opera, classical music, poetry, different older forms of literature. So this is, again, kind of going back to that divide between high art and popular art. Increasingly, popular art would get associated with the middle and working classes, whereas high art was more the domain of the affluent upper classes. And that's not totally different today. It's not as hard and fast, but some of those distinctions do remain. So again, she's kind of engaged in a lot of that. She's sort of tracking a lot of these changes and developments that are occurring in the middle of the 19th century, but she's very interested in what happens to a person's soul, what happens to a person's sort of moral compass when they move to the city. There's a lot of suffering and poverty and difficult obstacles that come along with city life. It can be alienating. You might be very far from your family. You might feel lost in the crowd or whatever. So she's very interested in how people were sort of adapting to these often new surroundings. And again, she was a believer that if you're going to survive the city and if you're going to be a good citizen, you need to open yourself up to certain emotional experiences. You need to be able to feel sympathy for others. And she's often sort of aiming for that in a lot of her letters. Interesting structure that she uses here. Her letters are written to an anonymous, other correspondent who she addresses in the second person. So she's creating this epistolary framework within which she's able to share her own sort of intimate and emotional experiences in Manhattan. But she also travels a little bit. If you're able to get to the fourth letter, she goes, I think, to Brooklyn and Hoboken, New Jersey. And Hoboken is sort of this idyllic place where she meets a couple of Native Americans, and she has this really interesting sort of moving scene that, again, was very much designed to make readers feel a certain way, to have a certain kind of emotional response. So again, we value that now, I think, more than a lot of critics maybe valued it back then. It was often dismissed back then and in the early 20th century when we were creating the academic discipline of American Lit. These appeals to emotion were often kind of dismissed as too feminine, too sentimental, too melodramatic. But now we recognize that these are some ways to really connect with readers. So we're not as dismissive of these kinds of rhetorical moves, these kinds of writing strategies today. And that's a reason why a lot of these authors are getting their due now in ways that they were not for many, many decades. So again, there's a real sense of moral duty in a lot of Child's letters. This idea of sort of interpreting the city in kind of a spiritual way and sort of providing a guide to a certain amount of reform, right? Sort of, again, looking to make things better. She was a reformer on many fronts, right? She wanted to help Native Americans, women, African Americans, the poor, immigrants, right? Let's create more sympathy. Let's create more common feeling amongst ourselves. Okay, especially in a city where things can be very hostile and alienating and isolating. And there can be sort of a lack of order, a lack of moral order. Child's trying to sort of do something about that, and she's trying to teach readers how to maybe better view one another, how to better view the city, again, through this lens of sympathy and sort of the right feeling, the right emotions. Okay, so that's enough for today. I hope you guys can get caught up and enjoy some of these examples of popular fiction. If you need anything, get in touch with me. Next week, we start on Melville.